The Germans will occupy Odessa this week, and that marks the first time in 1,500 years one power has control of Europe in a stretch from the North Sea to the Black Sea. Since the days of the Roman Empire, victory in the East was complete. I'm Indy Nidell. Welcome to the Great War. Last week, the Transcaucasian Diet was nervously awaiting the beginnings of peace negotiations with the Ottomans at Trabzon, even as Ottoman forces were advancing in the field further east. Russia signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with the Central Powers, which marked its official exit from the war. Russia had been forced to make enormous and humiliating concessions in terms of land and resources to avoid being crushed in the field by renewed German offensives. German High Command was also planning a gigantic offensive for the Western Front to begin in just a matter of days. There was German action in the field this week, though. Well, it actually began on the last day of last week, and it was against what you might think of as an unexpected enemy. See, the Germans had invaded Russia and Ukraine to force the acceptance of the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, and German troops in Ukraine were nearing Bakhmut, which was a major railway hub. A lot of soldiers of the Czechoslovak Legion were there at the moment. The Legion had fought with Russia. There were other legionnaires fighting with Italy and France. And with Russia leaving the war, these guys wanted to head for another Allied front to continue the fight. And were now in Ukraine planning to head eastward, since that was the only feasible direction of exit. Well, the Germans damn sure did not want them to do this. So this week saw the Battle of Bakhmut. From the 8th to the 13th, the Germans had 2 divisions of soldiers and the Legion just 2 regiments and an assault battalion. And yet, after a bloody battle, the Legion won, and the Germans negotiated a truce that would allow the Legion to head east for Siberia. Germany also landed troops in Turku, Finland, and even announced a German protectorate over Courland. Within a couple of weeks, they will occupy the port of Nikolaev, seizing a Russian battleship, 3 cruisers, 4 destroyers, 3 submarines, and the dockyard, sealing their eastern triumph. But what of Germany's allies? Well, Britain and the Entente were still trying to split Austria-Hungary from Germany. On the 9th, Jan Smuts went to Switzerland to talk to Austrian emissary Count Skrzynski. Skrzynski would later be foreign minister and prime minister of Poland in the interwar years. A condition for peace that he laid down to Smuts was, justice must be done to all peoples in the empire. So, autonomy for the Poles, Czechs, Croats, and everyone else. Talks continued for 5 days, but the Austrians then broke them off. Philip Kerr, who had been sent there as well by British Prime Minister David Lloyd-George, said that this was because Austrian Foreign Minister Count Czernin realized that once he had started negotiations, public opinion would never allow him to draw back if the Entente terms were reasonable, and that once he started negotiations, it was rather the case of a separate peace or the breakup of Austria-Hungary. And of course, any Austrians interested in negotiating with the Allies had to consider that Germany might win on the battlefield and Austria would be a direct beneficiary of that. And Germany was very soon to begin a Western Front offensive, hoping to gain that victory. On March 9th, the Germans launched a series of artillery barrages. This was a foreshadowing of the operations that would be their biggest offensive of the entire war. It was the Allies who had been the attackers the last couple years. The Somme, Arras, Passchendaele, the Nivelle offensive, these had all broken on the mighty German defenses. Now, the Germans would try to end the stalemate, and they were on the clock. For Quartermaster General Erich Ludendorff thought they needed to secure victory before fresh American troops could arrive en masse with the summer. Between Ypres and Saint-Quentin, the bombardment that day was 500,000 shells of mustard and phosgene gas. 1,000 tons of gas total. Thing is, for many, gas led to panic, fear, malingering, and outright desertion. The Germans even had a rule in place since the end of 1917 whereby alleged cases of gas poisoning who showed no definite symptoms were held for up to 2 days in unit medical inspection rooms to see what developed. They were not brought to field hospitals or gas clearing stations. Germany's ally, the Ottoman Empire, was also active this week. The Armenians at Ilika had been outflanked by the advancing and converging Ottoman columns. On the 11th, Armenian General Antranik gave the order to evacuate Erzurum. The Ottomans occupied it the following day and burned it. Hinnis had also been evacuated, with the volunteers there withdrawing into the Elishgurt Valley. The Trabzon Peace Conference finally opened the 14th, but by then the retreating Armenian troops were already at the old Russian border at Karagan. The Ottoman forces pursuing them were under Vehib Pasha, and the first item on the agenda at the conference was his telegram insisting on the immediate evacuation of the region ceded by Russia in Brest-Litovsk. The Transcaucasian delegates protested this since they did not recognize Brest-Litovsk and were not bound by it. Discussions of this nature continued, and other such machinations were going on far to the west. Since German subs were sinking all shipping, including neutrals, the Allies were trying to use neutral shipping in addition to their own, right? So back in January, the Dutch government agreed that the Allies could charter Dutch shipping provided there was enough left for their essentials and that the ships would not be required to enter the danger zone. So a system was running whereby Dutch ships were chartered to ship American supplies destined for Belgium and Switzerland. And for every such ship that reached a Dutch port, another was allowed to leave from Holland. However, now the Germans said they would use force to prevent ships from leaving Holland in exchange for arrivals from the States. So the Dutch were backing out of the agreement. So the Allies had to make new arrangements and could no longer guarantee that the ships chartered would not enter the danger zone. Then, last week, they demanded unconditional use of Dutch ships in their ports. The Dutch said, okay, as long as the ships aren't carrying any war material. But this would make them useless, so the Allies ended negotiations and just requisitioned Dutch shipping. They did, though, promise to replace all vessels sunk, and they sent the Dutch 100,000 tons of American wheat. The Allies were actually making all sorts of decisions at the moment. Their Supreme War Council met in London March 14th and 15th. The meeting began with Lloyd-George saying that he was taking British Army Commander Sir Douglas Haig's advice and not messing with Haig's and French General Philippe Pétain's reserves. French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau agreed with him. Okay, let me backtrack. We saw weeks ago that the Allies had created an executive war board to control a general reserve among their armies, with Ferdinand Foch as its leader. In early February, the board had decided to form a reserve of 30 divisions from the British, French, and Italian armies. Pétain and Haig resisted this and created their own reserves and arranged between themselves for reciprocal support in the West. The French could see sending as many as 20 divisions to aid the British, and Haig anticipated maybe sending 8 to the French sector. They coordinated the regions where they would back each other up. So now at the Council, the General Reserve idea was suddenly dismantled. It would still be a handful of divisions, but all but one would be on the Italian front. They did expect more divisions to join that reserve when the Americans really began arriving, though. Foch, of course, complained that they had just deprived the war board of executive power. Clemenceau eventually grew impatient with Foch's objections and told him, "Shut up." With the German attack imminent, the Allies had taken 2 steps forward in establishing unity of command and then taken 1 step back. And that was the week. The Germans still advancing, but losing to the Czechs and Slovaks. The Ottomans advancing, and the Austrians, the Dutch, and Allies all making move after move towards victory or mere survival. Germany may have pulled off an amazing feat by taking such an unprecedented amount of territory, but for nations like Austria-Hungary, it really was down to survival by now. But it does sound noble to speak of conditions like future autonomy for all people of the empire. And then you realize that at the same time, their ally is dumping 500,000 shells of poison gas on the people they're negotiating with. 500,000 tons of poison gas. But that is just business as usual by now. That is just modern war. If you'd like to learn more about the man behind the German chemical warfare program in the First World War, you can click right here to watch our episode about Fritz Haube. Can't believe we filmed that almost 3 years ago, guys. That's crazy. Okay, anyhow, our Patreon supporter of the week is Paul Finger. Yep, Paul Finger. Do you think that's his real name? I hope it's his real name. All right, Paul Finger, thank you and everybody else for your support on Patreon, which makes this show better and better. Do not forget to subscribe. See you next time.